who started off the first cell phone. Remember, we had quite some talk around who started off the first cell phone, and yet those guys are actually no longer there right now. And that's what it is. That's benchmarking for you. And you can actually say it does help companies. It helps organizations to stay at par. In some instances, also surpass competition. Just any questions, comments there? All good. All right. So, and those are some of the, in other words, we're just saying borrowing of ideas, but it does not end there, because then you want to also adapt them to the way you also operate. So it would for sure help you to surpass competition, or at least match competition. And so there are the three main types of benchmarking you might want to look at. There's what we call internal benchmarking. There is competitive benchmarking. There's also the process benchmarking. You might want to just go through and read some more about it. Internal benchmarking, competitive benchmarking, and then process benchmarking. Or you might want to imagine it in terms of what that would mean. So take, for instance, if we start off with this first one, the internal benchmarking, what would you think of there if you have to go through a process of what we call internal benchmarking? Remember how we've defined benchmarking. You borrow ideas from a competitor or from the best in class, and then you adapt those. And now if we say internal benchmarking, what do you think that would then refer to?
I think it's to use your subordinates, your staff, instead of taking from, instead of taking ideas from other places. I don't know.
Yeah, 100%, Nikio, you're actually right. So you're looking at your staff internally, and that's what you're saying. You're looking internally, you're looking at your staff, you're looking at the departments in which they are. So you would find, you could say, inside of our company, these functions. Maybe you got finance, we got IT, we got manufacturing, as in operations, and we've got all of these other departments. And you then say that function there, they seem to be set up pretty well in terms of this aspect. And so all functions, can we try and mesh the ICT function? Take, for instance, you guys, you're coming from ICT as a function. You then say, can we match the information systems department or information systems function in terms of what we do? And so we're going to benchmark all our practices for finance, for marketing, for operations, for HR on IT, based on this aspect we're looking for. So that at least if we can match the IT department, we know we got some uniformity within the company, and we've actually caught on to the best practices in terms of what we're looking for. That's internal, benchmarking, and totally agreed there, Sneaky. All right. And then we also then talk of competitive benchmarking and process benchmarking. You can pick on any one of these. I would say this is 2 and this is 3. Sorry, the way I'm using a mouse to write here. You can pick on any one of these. And what do you think it would refer to? Competitive benchmarking and process benchmarking. What would that be? What do you think?
And competitive, I would say, is looking outside your organization, looking at people that do the same thing as you and looking at how they do it.
Absolutely correct, Elanchi. So that's the thing. You're looking at your competition, and obviously you're looking at the best in class, those who are doing it very well. And then you then say, how are they doing it? And then can we also match them? In other words, you want to match your products, your services to this sort of guys. That would be your competitive benchmarking. And so the same would apply to your process benchmarking. There are so many ways of achieving a specific aspect, whether it's manufacturing or some other process that you're making. And companies don't normally use the same process to achieve the same end. Different processes to the same end, but you're then saying, who's got the best process to manufacture a car? Who's got the best process to manufacture soft drinks, take for instance, and who's got the best process to deliver a product to the customers? That's process benchmarking. And normally it can also be external rather than internal. It can also be internal in terms of processes. And so you'd want to benchmark. And this is important, especially for you guys as the managers, as the supervisors and leaders in your spaces, because always you're looking for the best way of doing things for the benefit of the customer. And so these kinds of benchmarking, you might always want to have it at the back of your minds, and looking out for ways to improve. That's the thing, you're looking for ways to improve internally, competitively, and in some of your processes that you then use to deliver your services or your products to the customers. All right, and so that's why we then say benchmarking is an attempt to leverage on the experience of other organizations, and that's important. You know the first ones who have walked this road, and so you want to leverage on the experience of others, and so you don't start off from very far off, but at least you do have some background looking at what others have done, and you can actually start from there and try and match them and ultimately surpass them. And so we've been talking about companies, like we're saying, who started off with the first cell phone, and others then benchmarked, but because the guys who started it off did not make it a continual process, including innovation, like we said earlier on, and now they're out of the market. But there are some countries who've used benchmarking so well, and they've become competitors in a big way. So take, for instance, China. And I think for China, we've given them a lot of names, and we've said they actually copy. You remember how people used to view China is those guys who copy, and you'd give them these names and all of it. But one could turn around and say, actually, benchmarking is part of what they used. Of course, there would be some other things to try and understand how things are made, like reverse engineering. They also used reverse engineering at some point. And later on, when they set the ground, they would benchmark how are these things done, and they would do a number of things to try and solidify the ground on which they are standing. This stage, they're very competitive. Even those countries we say are number one, they recognize China to an extent of being afraid of, if anything. And then we see it every day. But you'd find benchmarking is one of the ways they actually used to get to where they are, talking about China here. So benchmarking is a very important tool that organizations use, and you as managers, you would need to be aware of this, looking out for such, so as to also improve the organization. All right, so that's the concept of benchmarking there. You would find in your study guides, there are some questions there. Much earlier on, if you go through it, you'll see a few questions. Oh, Mahlala, well, welcome. I see Mahlala has just joined us here.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. At least the other meeting that I was on has just been adjourned. So it was an hour session, but at least we managed to wrap up everything in 30 minutes. Apologies.
Oh, great. Also great to have you then. I suppose it's to all our benefit that you managed to then attend. And so you can always catch up, Mahlala, and again, who else came a bit later on, Elensha as well. But we're just starting off here. So
Okay.
we're talking about this concept of benchmarking, which is very important. And again, makes a lot of sense for people like you, managers who are the thought leaders. You set the direction of the company, and you always want to remain competitive and not to lag behind. And again, talk about your industry that you are in, where you find there's a lot of change almost on a daily basis. And so it's important to always benchmark, look at the best in class, how they're doing it, and then obviously you then want to catch on. So benchmarking as a concept would possibly can also be split into these three here. what is our performance level? It's another way of asking the same questions that you're going to find in your study guides. What is our performance level, right? What are others' performance levels, right? And then adaptation comes through here. And so when you say, what is our performance level? In other words, where are we now? How do we do it? All right. And then when you look at others, you're not looking at everybody else, every Jack and Jill here. You're looking at the industry leaders, like we're saying. You need a bit of humility here, acknowledging that there are others who can do much better the things that you're doing. All right. And in this instance, you're actually looking for the best in class. How are they doing it? How did they get there? So between them and yourselves, there must be a gap. You see that? And you expect to see it. Where you are and where they are, there must be a gap. Otherwise, if there's no gap, there's no need to benchmark against such. Obviously, you could be leading them, and so you don't lead, you don't benchmark against those guys who are behind you. You benchmark against the best in class, like we say. And so you're looking for that gap. Where are we? Where are they? How big is the gap? And how do you characterize this gap? How do you define it? How can you describe it? Are there any elements within that gap? And obviously, you're really drilling down to the nitty-gritties. And ultimately, the creative adaptation is around how do we catch up in terms of this gap. And so all of those questions that you're actually going to see in your study guides are, who are they? Where are they? How are they doing? How did they get there? And all of it is to try and characterize this gap, identify a target, and how different are we from them, all right? And then we have the creative adaptation. How do we match them? And so within that creative adaptation, it's not as straightforward. It's not so cast in stone to say, this is what you're going to do, because obviously that's depending on you guys as the managers or how you see things. If you look at the country level perspective that we've been talking about, China, take for instance, how did they benchmark against the Americas of this world to an extent that right now, it's a question of argument to say, is America still the industry leader or the leading economy, or maybe the Chinese are actually now leading? But of course, if you look at their history, a country defined by poverty, and all you remember were those kung fu movies and the Bruce Lees and the Jackie Chans of this world and all of them. But they're turned around and there they are. They can make anything, and obviously having benchmarked, starting off with looking at who's doing it best, put structures and policies in place, and then right now it's a question of benchmarking. All right, and so there you are. And obviously through benchmarking and your creative adaptation, expectation is you would have the breakthrough performance, obviously, so as to match your industry leaders or even surpassing them. And so I suppose a picture would say 1,000 words there. All right, and so what are some of those key elements of benchmarking? The key elements of benchmarking. And so we're going to describe in a number of ways. If you go through your study guides, of course, they would classify it differently, but I thought this would then point you exactly to where you want, well, at what you want to look at, or some of those aspects really, when it comes to benchmarking in a sentence or two. Right. So some of those key elements of benchmarking, take for instance, the first one, it's all about measuring performance, right? And we're saying measuring performance requires some sort of units of measure. You want some units of measure. These can be called metrics, and they are usually expressed numerically. What are we saying here? We're acknowledging that what you cannot measure, you cannot control. You're trying to define a gap. Remember the gap analysis. Where are we? Where are they? Is there any difference? How do you know? If you don't have measures, it would be very vague, not so clear in terms of what you're looking at. In other words, we're then saying that gap has to be measured in metrics. That's how you'd say it, or expressed numerically. So if you're talking about production, take for instance, your industry leaders are doing 1 million units per year, and you're doing 700,000 units per year. Now you're talking, because the difference is 300. And that's what you're looking for, to say, how do we catch up with them? And we're looking for extra capacity to make 300, take for instance, so he has to make 1 million. But otherwise, if you don't have your metrics or something that's numerical, or unit of measurement, it's going to be a bit of a problem. And so remember, look out for such. In benchmarking, you will need some metrics for measurement, and they should be expressed in some way that expresses measurement, at least. And then also, the numbers achieved by the best-in-class organization become the target. Those numbers, whether it's in terms of customers, whether it's in terms of quality. And it's important to talk about this, especially as we're talking about metrics, and those metrics become a target. Because there are some things that are very difficult to measure, like take, for instance, quality, right? Quality, how do you measure quality? Obviously, you will need some sort of measures. And so if you're talking about computers, whether desktops or laptops, if you say Apple is the best in class, how do you measure that? Do we have metrics for it? If you're talking about quality, or if you're talking about cars again, if you say the Mac is the best car, or the Range Rover, or whichever car you think, how do you know if you are Renault or you Toyota or so? And so you will need some metrics, and then you will also need that best-in-class organization as a target, and you know exactly what you're looking for. That's very important. That. And also, we always say managers need to understand why the performance between their organization and the best-in-class differs. And what is that here? We're actually referring to the gap, right? That is the gap. Why the performance between your organization and that of the best in class, why is there a difference? And that's why we were saying you need to establish a gap and then try and characterize that gap. What makes it up? Obviously, within the characterization is where the difference is. And you can actually then say, look, they're different because of 1, because of 2, because of 3. Very important. Have you ever wondered why? So take, for instance, Coca-Cola is a very old organization, and they actually had moments of bleeding. I'm not so sure if they're still not in terms of the beverages, all right? And of course, we've had some other companies that have come up to make beverages. So Coca-Cola, you know, they've got Coke, Fanta, Orange, and all of these guys, these other, variants they have. And then we've had some other companies also coming up and into the beverage industry. And you can think of names. I've seen quite a few such companies that are also in the beverage. And they would have an orange subject, an orange product. Oops. Then, sorry. Okay. So you would have the sort of color from a product perspective, but it will never taste the same. So Coke, the black substance that you know, there are some other companies that have come up with the same sort of product, looks the same color, never tastes like Coke itself, or never tastes like the Fanta Orange and all of these. Why is that? And obviously, you can then tell what also organizations do, trying to protect that gap, to then say you will never be able to establish what's exactly in there. And so again, you can expect that it's something that you'd need to know as managers. All right. And of course, I was trying to explain this point here, that understanding the reasons for the difference or the differences where you are, where the target company is, that would equip you as managers to actually organize the improvement or the improvement efforts so as to meet your desired goals. That's quite important. So there's a bit of a hair splitting in there as you looking through the gap. You're really looking at some fine margins, sometimes some very fine information. But at the end of it, you have to actually pinpoint it to say, we've gotten it here. This is what we're looking for. this is what we have to change. All right, it's part of your benchmarking. Any questions or comments so far?
I'm fine from my side. Yes, all good.
All right, thanks for that. Yes, thank you. All right, so apart from these key elements of benchmarking, obviously you need them as a manager, but why do we benchmark? Why do we have to benchmark? Well, of course, you can think of one or so, but essentially, these are some of the reasons that you're seeing on my slide now. Some of the reasons for benchmarking, why you have to do it. And again, it's crucial in so many ways for the organization's survival. Even at personal level, I think we could be benchmarking unknowingly. We could be doing that unknowingly, actually. But, we have to benchmark, and we do benchmarking. And these are some of the reasons, really. So benchmarking actually forces an external orientation, which is critical in a competitive world. So you're not inward looking only, but you have some external orientation, which is where the competition is. What are others doing? And how can we actually get there? And that's the part of it, the external orientation right there. Quite crucial. And I think you can think of some organizations, obviously, that took 360 degrees turn. And you wondered, how did they come to this? And obviously they had to look externally and how others are doing it. And then suddenly you realize the product became so different, part of your external orientation right there, right? And then also benchmarking can signal to the organization if and by how much it has fallen behind the leading organizations or the leading players in an industry in certain aspects. And again, this explains why some companies fell off and never came back. We spoke of Nokia the other time. All right. Nokia, of course, they were not the first ones with cell phones, but when they came onto the market, they had certain aspects that were pretty good. Their battery, in terms of the cell phone, you remember how long lasting it was. The phone seemed to be very strong. I still have a few old Nokias around, still working, just that they are old, and obviously technology has moved. But obviously, you can explain this from an external orientation perspective, that when others are changing, the organization somehow is a bit content in terms of their leadership or in terms of what they have. And from then on, you get left behind, and that could then be very much long lasting in terms of you being left behind. So yeah, that's how you can actually explain that aspect right there. All right. I hope that makes sense, right? And then also, we can look at benchmarking from a personnel perspective. In other words, your employees, it motivates them, as you would see it from my word here. It actually motivates your personnel to strive to actually higher objectives. And that, knowing very well that there are some other organizations who are doing the same as you, and they are able to achieve better than you. And obviously, employees, they see that, they would say, but how can we match these guys? And so that's a way of motivating your employees as well, right? And then again, benchmarking is time and cost effective and cost efficient. Because why? The process involves imitation, process involves adaptation rather than just pure invention. So remember we spoke about innovation and how different it is from invention, but there is a lot of creativity in there. But when you benchmark, that whole process of benchmarking again feeds into imitation. How are others doing it? Adaptation. How can we mold our own processes and organization to actually fit and make this company that we're looking at will happen to be the best in class? So from that perspective, it is time and cost efficient. It forces you to be innovative because some of the processes like we're seeing here are part of your innovation. And then benchmarking enhances innovation by requiring organizations to constantly scan the external environment and then to use the information obtained to improve your own processes. That's benchmarking there. So I think from here you can see that benchmarking is directly related to innovation. Very, very important. And so, like we're saying, it applies to the corporates as much as it applies to us at a personal level. You're looking, as much as it also applies to departments within the same organization. So these are some of the reasons why a company would look at benchmarking and see it as a worthwhile process to actually follow, or as a technique worthwhile to embrace and embed in part of your processes. All right, so much around some of those reasons for benchmarking. Don't forget, you've got any questions, please raise your hand. You can always unmute yourself and let me know if you've got any questions or comments for that matter. All right. And so, having had your reasons set, how do you benchmark? What sort of process would you follow to then benchmark? I suppose those are some of the questions that would come to mind. Where do you start? How would you craft the process of benchmarking? And you would find in your study guides, they got a couple of those processes. You can describe them differently. You can give different headings, but at the end of the day, these are some of the elements you're going to see in some of your headings in your study guides there in terms of benchmarking. And we call this the benchmarking process. And as I'm acknowledging here, that although the process in benchmarking, it may vary from one organization to the next one, because you're looking at possibly different sort of areas you intend to benchmark. But there are these 6 steps that are actually core to the benchmarking process. And I'm saying and acknowledging here that the terminology of the 6 processes could also be different, but it gives you the underlying core steps and possibly what you're looking for as well within the benchmarking process. So the first thing you would have to do is exactly this here. Decide what to benchmark. Right? And this is very specific. What do you want to benchmark? Right? Is it your quality of your products? Is it the quantity in terms of production? Is it some process? And so and so and so. So, but you have to decide what you want to benchmark. And I think it's very important that you are also quite specific about that which you intend to benchmark. All right. So you have to state it that, look, we want to benchmark this. And we are Dell. We want to, our best in class is Apple, right? And so what do we want to benchmark? You have to then be specific. It's very important. And when you've done that, the next stage is to understand the current performance. So like we said earlier on here, understanding current performance. I got some descriptions as we're going along. My next slides actually speak to these 6 steps. Where are we? Where do we want to be? Remember that. I'm going to describe it some more. And then when you've decided what you want to benchmark and you've established the gap through what we call the gap analysis, when you're looking at your current performance, obviously you're looking at this in tandem with the industry leaders, where they are and where you are. Obviously there is that gap. And then you make plans. You make plans on covering that gap. You study others, right? You study others. And I think it also speaks to what we mentioned earlier on, that you need to be humble enough to accept that there are some guys who are doing it better than you at your organization. So you have to study others, look at them, how are they doing it? And then you learn from, and I suppose there would be questions around, how do you study others? And you don't have access to their process and all of it. How do companies do that when it comes to studying others? That could be a question. Maybe we might need to look at it a bit later. And then learn from the data. So there's some assumption here that whilst you're studying others, you're also collecting some data. And so you want to learn from the data and then use the findings. Those 6, I would say, are the core steps when it comes to the benchmarking process. And like I'm promising that you would need to then describe some more, because there's a lot that happens on each and every one of these steps. Right, so maybe I got a few notes here, you know, taking it from the first one, like deciding on what to benchmark. What do you want to benchmark? Let me start off with that one. All right. So here you are. You begin by thinking about the mission and critical success factors, right? And I think in your day-to-day operations, you speak about some of these. What is our mission and vision? Remember, and that is about your strategy as an organization. And then what are some of your critical success factors? Those things that you have to get right to actually succeed, right? Put a bit of a description here around your critical success factors. They normally relate to certain activities or processes upon which the organization relies in order to realize its vision. These could be the pillars within your operations, the pillars within your processes, the pillars within your departments, and on and on. So what are they? What are those critical success factors? And what is your mission? Some questions can also help you to decide what to benchmark. You know, take for instance, I got a few here, a few questions around what you want to benchmark. What process are most problematic in the organization, right? And you possibly don't have a solution, and yet others are doing it pretty well. So you might want to say, let's benchmark it. Who's doing better in this process? But you need to know that process, what processes are most problematic. But I think you can also see problematic here. It's a good place to start off from. You got problems in that area and you're looking for solutions. And again, a solution could come through based on benchmarking. All right. So what processes are problematic in your organization? Identify those. They're good candidates for benchmarking. Or which processes contribute the most to customer satisfaction or customer dissatisfaction? Again, you're looking for a problem here. Customer satisfaction, of course, that's a good place to start off from. But customer dissatisfaction, obviously, it's almost similar to a problematic area. And you're then saying, how do we fix it? Let's look at others who are doing better in that area. They possibly don't have complaints from their own customers. So those are processes best for benchmarking. What processes have the most potential to set us apart from competitors? And that's what champions do. You know, those are things they look at. Apart from looking at the pain points for customers, you're also looking at those specific aspects in terms of processes that have got the ability to set you apart, to be different. So, you know, other companies look at TCM, take for instance, and they'll say TCM, when it comes to that, they are the best in class. And I think you also do it. You would always say, when it comes to this aspect, these guys are the best in class. You would always know. You would always know whether it's the engineering excellence, whether it's the manufacturing excellence, whether it's the delivery in terms of management of the supply chain. Those are processes. Who are the best in class? All right. And so what processes have the most potential to also set you apart is from your competition. That's also important. You're looking from an internal perspective. And you know those processes, if you get them right, your customers are going to be happy. And obviously, that should translate to your sales or some numbers there. And so those are some of you know, the first step in terms when it comes to benchmarking. Remember, the first step, decide what to benchmark. And then the second step, I'm just going backwards a bit. Second step is understand current performance. Understand current performance. And so in terms of description here, you will be required to undertake some analysis, hair splitting and all of that. But in essence, a careful analysis of your processes so as to decide if it's important, all right. Attention should then be paid to circumstances that result in exceptions to the normal routine, right? You understanding current performance right there, and also exceptions. Exceptions generally consume a great deal of the process resources, right? Again, you're trying to understand where you are, your current performance. Normally, we say it is actually advisable to work with operators that would function in the processes, as they also have the first-hand knowledge and would be relied upon so as to implement any changes agreed upon. Is a way of advice. I think that would make a lot of sense. You want to work with those operators that function in the process and they have first-hand knowledge, and you can actually rely upon them so as to implement any changes, if any. Right? That's all part of understanding your current performance. And then we spoke about metrics earlier on, which are measures, and the use of some metrics for these unit costs or hourly rate or scrap, or rejects rate and on with the scrape rate. So the use of those metrics is good because they enable the comparison to results realized after the change has been implemented. In other words, we're saying what you cannot measure, you cannot control. How do you know how much you need, or what sort of effort you need to put in there? And so that's the whole reason of metrics. It's very important. Just like you guys do when you're having those conversations around performance management with your subordinates, with your employees within your department. So performance, just as good performance, you would always get this pushback to say, but what is good performance and what is bad performance? You have to put some metrics in there to then say, oh, I see, because we meant you to achieve so much, but you achieved this, which is less than that. And so now we understand that even this number is below what is acceptable. Right. And so that's the use of your metrics right there. That's all part of understanding your current performance. I'm not so sure if we have left anything there, when it comes to understanding your current performance. So remember where you've come from. You want to decide what to benchmark, understand current performance, and then we said you then also have to plan, right? And so what happens within planning? Right. Good starting point. Benchmarking planning should be a learning process. And that's what it is. You learning what has to be achieved, and you are humble enough to accept that there are guys better than you, or there are companies better than you who can actually do this better. So always take benchmarking as a learning process. And so when we benchmark and we say we are behind, or that department is doing less than that other one, it's not for punitive purposes, but is part of the learning process. And so everyone is open because they know it's learning. We all learning here, right? And in your planning, constitute a benchmarking team. Very important. You have to constitute a benchmarking team. And obviously you select them according to your own criteria based on what you're doing. But you need a team that spearheads this whole benchmarking, and you call that a benchmarking team. And then decide what kind of benchmarking to perform. And I think we spoke of a couple of them. Remember, internal, competitive, process benchmarking. And again, it could be much more than that. I suppose when it comes to kinds of benchmarking, you can always fit in whatever process based on what you're trying to achieve. That's what I'm saying here, or what you're looking at. So you want to decide what kind of benchmarking you want to perform. And then decide on the data-related issues. How many, how much, and on. Sometimes it may be known that you would find it also requires some resources. And so you might need to throw a bit of money at this whole process. But how much money? And that's what we're talking about here. Deciding on the data-related issues. How much are we going to spend? How do we plan to, how much do we plan to spend over here? It's part of your planning. And then identify the candidates that you desire to benchmark. Right. The candidates that you desire to benchmark against. So you can almost say it's not always that you benchmark against one company. It could be a couple of them. To say we know these three guys are the industry leaders when it comes to our industry. So you then could benchmark against all of those, very much allowed. Right? And then also, finally there, set your time scales. Very important. It's part of measurement, because always some of these processes, they start at some point, they have to also come to an end at some point. And those are your time scales. What time do we start? For how long do we expect this to be running? All right. And then when do we intend to finish this? That's part of your benchmarking. Are we going to take 6 months? Do we expect it to run for a year or even more? And again, you have to decide on that. All right. So that's the planning stage. Remember, we're talking about the different stages here. So let me just take you back to my slide here. Decided what to benchmark, understand current performance, and then you plan, you speak about all of those things we've been talking about. And then study others. That's the fourth step. After your planning, you intend to study others. And here we are. And like we're saying here, benchmarking studies mostly utilize two kinds of information, right? First of all, a description of how the best-in-class processes are practiced. First part. The second part, the measurable results from their usage. Studying them. A description of the processes, can you describe how they do it? Because ultimately you also want to, benchmark against those guys. So these kinds of information may be obtained through some kind of research. You could conduct research that would generate some primary data or secondary data. That's one way. But I also said the studying of others is a bit difficult. I just wanted you to imagine here, or you have some sort of imagination to say, how else, apart from the research, okay, research could be an encompassing process. But how else can you study others? Knowing very well that you are competitors, you do not have access, like direct access in terms of what they do. How do companies do it when they want to benchmark and there's something they want from competition? How do they normally do it?
I think we can learn something when they advertise their work through, and also when they post it on the social media, or when they share their work maybe on website. It's where we can learn from them, I think.
Yeah. So that would definitely be one of the ways. When they advertise, there could be some snippets from there or some nuggets that you can actually pick and then say, look, we've seen, and then we can study in the way they do things, and you benchmark from that perspective. Thanks, Nikiwe. Avishka, are you there? And welcome, Avishka.
Thank you. Another way to have a rationality of benchmarking is to see what's currently being in the market from market research in terms of what other companies are doing or what processes are being followed, and based on experience, try and benchmark procedures similar to that in terms of research.
Yeah. Absolutely. study others, how they're doing it. You want to also look at their products. Yes, and obviously compare with yours. But that's another way of benchmarking. Totally agreed, Atishka there. Totally agreed. Are there any other ways that companies also use when they want to study others? And I know some companies actually are very active at studying others, and they would use some methods. You might refer to it as a bit, some would say it's a bit dirty, or it's trickery, and all of that stuff. But still, they go to such lengths so as to study others. So take, for instance, I'll give you one of the ways, whilst you're thinking of any other. Some companies would actually employ employees from a competitor company, right? And so they would headhunt, certain people from specific companies. They have a target, which are a target, and they employ those. And you possibly then wanting to get more information on how things are done on the other end from those employees now, which now happen to be your employees. It's a way of studying others. I've seen quite a couple of companies that actually do that. Employ or make offers to employees in competitor companies, and when they come through, you then give them those aspects of your processes or products that you intend to benchmark. And obviously through that process, you benchmark, you copy, you see how they're doing it, and then you implement it in your company. So yeah, another way of companies do that. So the one I spoke about here is
Sorry, but I'm sorry, but do you ask that employee that you employ that do you direct ask them how, or maybe how can you take that knowledge from that employee that you employed, the employee that is from your competitor? Maybe how can you
yeah.
how can you take how can you find out their main
And
ideas from that employee?
and thanks for that, Nikki. And that's a very important question. That do you directly ask them? And I wanted to throw it back at the group. How do you get, so you've employed an employee from a competitor company, they are in your organization now. Do you directly ask them? How do you do it to make sure you get information from them, and in the process you also study what's happening on the other end? Do you directly ask them the question to say this, or how do you go around it? I wanted to throw it back at the group. Yes, Elensha?
So I can tell you that it's happened within my department recently, where exactly this has happened. A competitor has employed a person that worked for us. They were directly asked those questions, and they are now actively targeting our customers. So yes, I want to say yes, they are directly asked, and those people that have been employed by our competitors are made really good offers that they can't refuse, and that's the reason they are so willing to share information. It doesn't mean that that makes it right, and the ethics and all of that comes into play, but that's what's happened.
True. Yeah, 100%. And thanks for that example where you've actually seen it in practice. The employment of someone directly in your department because they're looking for specific information. That's true. And it can actually be very difficult to then point at the company that is employed one for such purposes of studying others and getting information and say they're being unethical. They're only saying, look, we making an offer. It's more like head hunting in terms of what we're looking for. And deep down they look, we're looking for someone who's in such a department in this organization because there is that aspect we've defined as part of what we want to benchmark, because it's a problem process, it's a problem area, that sort of thing. So yeah, talk about ethics and all of it, but that's how companies actually do it. Even countries, and that's how countries do it. You know, the other day I was actually laughing at, again, talk about China. And so they employed uh, British pilots, fighter jet pilots. I think you could have picked it some 2-3 weeks ago. It was actually on news. So, and you know how the state of the world right now, and you've got these war drums beating all around us. And China
Yes.
now, they have their,
Zapiruzan.
is someone speaking there? So, and so talk about China. You'd find then they wanted some fighter jet pilots. They do have their jets, but there's something they are looking for, and one could tell there's something about the British pilots that they are looking for, and they targeted them. They went for the British pilots, and then Britain, having seen it, they started discouraging their pilots to say, anyone who gets an offer from China, we are not allowing you to take it. Because we know they are looking for British pilots, but they never said what exactly they were looking for, really. Never said. And ultimately, I'm not so sure. I think it's something that's still on because it's just over 2 weeks ago when that was on. And you can tell, like we're seeing the world is almost being set for war. And you can tell who are the players in there. And some are wanting to see, well, how do you train your guys when it comes to flying these fighter jets pilots? What are some of the techniques you guys use? And they employ them, offer them, not so much for giving them money and all of it, but to actually know what you guys have and what you're doing for that day of war. And so that's how it would actually go. So that's part of studying others. And like we're saying, you would find there are a whole lot of tactics and tricks that are used by companies. And again, it all started off with this NQS question to say, do you directly ask them? And I suppose that's an aspect we haven't dealt with. Do you, when they've come in, do you actually ask them to say, how do you do this? I'm not so sure how you see it. This is open to discussion, but I suppose one of the ways, if you really don't want to come out straight, would be to put them in such a department, the problem department, and you then say, run it, right? Run it. You put them in that problem area, and you give them the problem. You don't quite say this is what we're looking for, but obviously somebody is faced with a problem. They would then lean on the information they already have from the previous company they were working for. They would say, "Oh, this is it." But you know where I'm coming from. This is how we used to do it. And so from that perspective, you get your information even without saying, asking a direct question, but just put them in the problem area and you say, can you please fix this? And that way you are actually studying how they're doing it. And in the process, they've also brought to you these new processes of fixing such a problem. All right. And again, I hope also from SneakyOS perspective, I hope that answers your question there. But it's important to study others, and these others are those we're saying the best in class. All right. Now, at some point, the next step is actually learning from the data. I think we agreed one of the stages within your benchmarking process is collecting data, obviously, and analyzing it. All right. So you also want to learn from the data that you've collected in the benchmarking study. And so whilst you want to learn from the data, you might need to answer a series of questions. And this is what you're seeing on my slide here. Some of the questions you might want to answer really. Like take, for instance, is there a gap between your organization's performance and that of the best-in-class company? All right. I think I spoke at length around the gap analysis. We call this the gap analysis. Where we are, where the best in class are, the gap in between. All right. Is there a gap? Obviously, you want to answer that and you're learning from the data. And then with that question, why is there a gap? right? Why is there a gap between us and them, all right? What does this best-in-class organization do differently that is better, which could explain this gap we're seeing? And so you ask these questions, and obviously the answers are part of you trying to learn from the data. In other words, you want to make the data speak. What is this data saying at the end of the day? What is the gap? All right. How much is the gap? How big is the gap? How long is the gap? And all of those sort of questions when you go through what we call the gap analysis. But you have to establish that gap, because without the gap, then you cannot benchmark. You want to see the gap. Where are we? Where are they? How big is it? And then what would be the resulting improvement if best-in-class practices are adopted? So you actually want to adopt what these guys do as the best-in-class, and you say, what would be the resulting improvement? Can it explain this gap? If we adopt this, can we really cover the gap? Or maybe there's another aspect which is not defined in this gap, which we also need to look at, so as to catch up with these best-in-class, as it were. Okay, and so you'd actually want to also look at it from that perspective. And at the end of it, 3 different outcomes may be revealed by the benchmarking studies. So there could be a positive gap, there could be some parity, or there's a negative gap. I'm talking about this here. Let me just pick up my pen, right? So you could have a positive gap, you could have some parity, or you could have a negative gap. And obviously this is learned from the data that you're actually studying, all right? And so obviously you as managers, you then have to make a decision. What do we do with this positive gap? What do we do with this negative gap? If you're at par, in other words, you are on equal terms, you're almost equal, what do we do with this parity? Do we need to do something so as to then create a gap between us and them? So you need to learn from the data from that perspective. All right. So all of these questions would give you certain answers, which you might refer to as your findings, right? And how do you use these findings, really? We always say this. Through the benchmarking process, you're going to employ some resources, you're going to use some resources. That could be money, that could be financial, and all sorts of resources. And the benchmarking would be a wasted effort if changes do not result in circumstances where there is a gap, a negative gap. So you need to employ benchmarking, you expect changes. If the changes do not result, then obviously it's all wasted. You wasted your time, really. And so you're looking for such. And so you have to use your findings, whether it's the information that you've picked up and possibly what you've learned from the data, you want to use it so as to make changes. So ultimately, we're saying with benchmarking, at some point, we expect to see changes. Otherwise, it's a futile effort. So whilst in an effort to use the findings must be communicated to those who can authorize or enable the suggested improvements. Very important. So you communicate these findings to the authorities, those who have to authorize the usage of resources, or those who are able to authorize suggested improvements or suggested changes. So whilst you're using your findings, make sure you also communicate. An agreement by process operators and management on the desired changes, also critical. What do we want as a change? In other words, that change lead you to a specific destination. So there must be some agreement around this destination. Do we have what we call goal congruence? Are we aiming at the same thing? That's your goal congruence. Are we aiming at the same thing? And so that's important to have an agreement by the process operators or by management on the desired change. What do we want to change? And then obviously an action plan should be put in place, it should be put together, and obviously the action plan would address the sort of change that you're looking at. There are some steps, as you would see on my slide here, steps for developing an action plan. Like take, for instance, specify tasks. Everything then is translated into tasks. It's translated into sequence tasks. It's translated into the resource needs, the task schedule. There is different responsibilities for each task, description of the expected results, and also specification of the methods for monitoring the results, all part of an action plan. But again, this is not cast in stone. You'd find it might vary from one organization to the next one. And so all of what I've been describing here, let me just take you back to my first slide when we spoke about the benchmarking process, right? Your benchmarking process, and this is where we're coming from, to say that that's how it would roughly look like. It might be different. Others might have 4 because they took some of the stages and merged them in terms of the process, or some of the steps and expanded them to make much more. But those are crucial. In other words, that's what you're looking for in any benchmarking process. What do you want to benchmark? All right. How is it performance currently? And don't forget, how is competition doing in terms of that? And then you make your plans like we described, and then you want to study others. And whilst you're studying others, and I think our discussion around studying others, you noticed it could involve other departments as well. So take, for instance, if you want to headhunt some few employees from your competitor companies, you find you also need HR in there. You are involved from your IT perspective, and you're saying, I know what we're looking for, or the sort of person with what sort of qualifications, all right? If you go that route, learn from the data, and then you use the data. So I'm not so sure, if you look at these 6, is there anything else you could add in terms of a process? Or maybe something you would say, maybe this might not really need it.
I think this is fine on my side. I don't have anything to add.
Oh, perfect. Perfect, thank you. All right, so in your study guides, you're going to see some more processes. They could slightly differ from here, but you'd find the content is around about the same. That's what you're really looking at. All right. Yes, Matlala, go for it.
Can I ask something, maybe to extend this, a bit further?
Yes.
Partnering with a bigger company, just to get you up to speed with your comparison, and obviously setting them, as your guide, or basically, where you want to get your business to. Will that be regarded, as a benchmarking or one of the benchmarking options?
Yeah, and actually, thanks for mentioning that. And I would actually outwardly say that would be part of benchmarking as well. You partner with another organization because maybe you want to study them, all right? Because they bring something to the party, which is better than what you have, or at least it's something, they bring something that you don't have, and you also want to install it in your own organization. So those partnerships could be part of this whole benchmarking process. Maybe part of your plans, or maybe it's part of your studying others, or obviously whilst you're studying them, you might want to also gather some data, which you might also want to use. So absolutely correct. In fact, we can add it as one of the ways in which companies actually use to benchmark partnerships. Would you have an example there, Matlala, of a company that you would think this could be some
The reason
form of
why I'm
benchmark?
asking this is we do have, such in our company, because we have our fellow brother, CIT. So I know they are like levels, aren't the same, unequal. But yeah, we do support them, and then vice versa, trying to get them, in the upper range, of business. So yeah, we
Yeah.
do have that, and I don't know within other divisions because of I'm talking more on services side. So Elencia, I don't know from your side sales, do you also approach the IT maybe for assistance, with resources and other stuff that may be related maybe to your business, your core business in sales?
We don't. No,
Oh, okay.
no, we don't.
All right. Yeah,
We
it's
would
mostly the
probably do the latter of headhunting in inverted commas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to
Okay.
ask, so you mentioned, or of course, we can use these discussions for learning purposes in class, and by all means we talk about anything. And so you speak of ICT, and you guys are TCM. I wanted to hear from you, Mahlala. Are they similar in terms of what you do and them, or maybe it's some kind of a complementary relationship? And then who are bigger, yourselves as TCM and them as ICT?
This might be, confidential info. I'm not sure if I'm even allowed, to share more details. But basically, it's the IT. So we work closely with them, and then we provide obviously, support to them, and they doing the same to us. But in terms of levels, and business, because of we give them more business, and trying to upper them, to be at the higher level. So I can just end it there, and not
Yeah.
go too further with that. And I'm saying it might be something that I'm not even allowed to
All right.
just talk about in this session. So I was just making that as an example that yeah, we do have same structure existing in our company
But
in
do
terms
we,
of partnering.
okay, so but do we practice some of the things that they are doing, or we just give support, and do we
No,
practice what they're doing as part of um yeah, but do we practice their strategies, or we just support only and work together only?
we work
We as
together.
TCM.
Yes, we work together, and then there has to be an alignment. But mostly, it's them coming across. Not us, going across to them. The help that we offer, it's basically, with support, and other stuff that I won't obviously, mention.
Mhm.
But most stuff, it's one direction
Okay.
because of yeah, we mostly, supporting them, and then in turn they do support us, with resources. But at the bigger picture, yes, support, it's across depending what they offer and what we offer back to them.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah. And again, thanks for those questions and those contributions. But Mahlala, you'd find what you're mentioning, it's important. As much as it's confidential, some of the things are accepted, especially if you had competition around you. But at the end of the day, the onus is on you guys to make decisions. And so that partnership that you're talking about, it's managers that you are around you, and one of these days, it could actually be you. And you might be required to actually assess this partnership. Are we getting some leverage out of it, or maybe we just being drained, or have we leveraged enough in terms of this partnership? And again, it's managers like you, so you might have those aspects you might regard as confidential, but at the end of the day, again, you still have to talk about it to say, are we benefiting anything by being in partnership with this sort of a company? And managers like you would make such decisions. And so that's why we just talking about it to say, um, you still need to have your tentacles out there, and possibly you have your eyes and ears on the ground in terms of some of the benefits you could get from such, including benchmarking. One day you're going to discontinue this sort of relationship? Would we have learned enough throughout our time that we engaged with this company? That sort of thing. And so that's why we're saying you still need to look out for it and make an assessment. And these partnerships, like you said, partnerships is a way of benchmarking, as a step of benchmarking. How do you make the best out of it? So it's very important, and an important point you also raise there. All right, so much around the benchmarking process itself. So now much of what we're looking at is something that you look out for, and you trying to create some competitive advantage and catch up, first of all, with your competitors, and then ultimately create some competitive advantage. But we also have some areas where you would find benchmarking might be required. It might not be really competitive, but it's something that you meant to, it's a standard that you meant to achieve, so as to be recognized, or at least to comply with the laws of the land. It's also part of benchmarking. And remember, we said benchmarking goes hand in hand with best practices. So best practices for competitive advantage, first of all, or maybe best practices as required by industry laws. And so benchmarking would also fit in here. Now you see in my slide here, we talk of codes of good practice, which require benchmarking. So you'd find the industry laws might specify that we expect you to have this and that and that. I'll give you an example. If you're a bread manufacturer, think of Albany, right? Blue Ribbon and all of those guys. And they do bread as part of their products, right? The quality of the bread and all of that might be different. And I suppose you guys also have your own preferences in terms of which kind of bread you want. But we also have industry laws about good practices to say a loaf of bread should weigh how much? Do you guys know? A standard loaf of bread, how much should it weigh?
700. Is it not
Yes.
760? 7 or
Seven-
600 grams.
700 grams, you're right. A standard loaf of bread should weigh 700 grams. And this is applicable to everyone who's in this industry. So whether you're Albany, whether you're Blue Ribbon, and all of these guys, a standard loaf of bread should weigh 700 grams. And that's a code, which is part of, what do you call that? The Standards Association. They would measure that. It has nothing to do with competitive advantage, really, but it's a code of good practice. Now, if you then churn out there some loaves of bread which are less than 700 grams, and you sell them at the same price, like a standard loaf, if a loaf of bread now is costing 20 rand or so, and you put out there loaves of bread which are 500 grams, and you sell them for the same price, now you're flouting the codes of good practice right there. And so that's another way of benchmarking. And so from a corporate perspective, you need to look out for these codes of practice. And you benchmark yourselves against those. So loaf of bread, 700 grams, because that's what it has to be. It has nothing to do with the quality of the bread and all of it. So like we're saying here.
But
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I have to raise my hand. Yeah.
Go for it,
I was saying at Pick n Pay, they have a big bread. So the 700 is a minimum only, or it's just a standard that they must follow. Because I saw some very big one at Pick n Pay, of which maybe it can be 900 grams or something. But 700 is the minimum only, or it's just a standard that they need to follow. For example, with the bread.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. And I think maybe from the group perspective, you've noticed that. Is it Pick n Pay or ShopriteGiant? Those guys sometimes they have some bread, and you look at it, it doesn't seem to weigh 700 grams. And then you also you mentioned Pick n Pay. Food lovers, I think, have seen such. and they have this huge loaf of bread, very big, okay, and yet we're talking about 700 grams. How do they align 700 grams with the small loaf or the big loaf? If you see how they do it. So take, for instance, for Pick n Pay, not, is it ShopRite, I think, would give you a loaf of bread and you hold it, it doesn't seem to weigh and match the normal loaf of bread, and they would sell it for 5 rand. I'm not sure how much it is right now, but it would be much
Yeah,
less.
it has its own name actually.
Yeah, it has
Yeah,
its own name,
so
Masala.
yeah, they call it something else. Basically, they say, it disappears or it melts.
Oh,
So yeah, so the minute you put it in your mouth and then it's gone, just like that. You don't need, to even chew it. That's how light it is. Yes.
oh yeah. Of course, quite some attraction in terms of that. You don't have to chew it. You put it in the mouth, it
Yeah, there's a
melts.
specific name, that they call that kind of bread, especially those 5 rands
Yeah.
loaf. Yeah.
And so the leg of the 700 grams is actually made up in the 5 rands rather than 20 rands. So take, for instance, and so it won't really cost 20 rand. It would be 5 or 7 rands. And so you'd find when the standards, guys from the Standards Association come through, they would always then see that, look, it's not 700 grams, but it's less than that, but it's not costing 20 rand, and it's an in-house brand, like Mahlala is saying. It's an in-house brand. And so that way they are not prosecuted, because then the price matches the weight of the bread. Same goes with the big ones. Of course, I've noticed the big ones, would they exceed the price of a standard loaf of bread? Sometimes it matches it, or they could exceed, and they would justify it with the weight of the bread. But there is a standard which is defined in the codes of good practice. So every industry does have those. Right. Okay. So I suppose that's an explanation around your codes of good practice there. And important to notice that these good codes of practice are not law really, but they're just guidelines to help the members. They are developed through consultations with the industry workers and employers, government included. And normally, unless there is an alternative that achieves an equivalent or better results, normally these good codes should be followed. And that's how it goes. And so you will need to be aware of this. All right. Any questions, comments, Masala?
No, nothing from my side. I just have something for Butali, but that will be just before we adjourn and dismiss the class.
Okay. Apologies. Again, my where I'm set up to do my lectures, it's a bit open, and my neighbor's dogs barking over there. All right. So to just take note of these, and so in your study guides, you're going to see some of these codes of good practices which are issued by the minister, and they're applicable to different industries, really. So like working time, there's a code. Is it standard that everyone should work 15 hours a day? Not really. Maybe the standard is 7 or 8 hours with the lunch break and the tea break in between. Disability in the workplace, there's a code around that. Employment equity, again, we see a lot of these around. Sexual harassment cases, these cases, how do you handle these? All right. Integration of employment equity into the human resources policies, codes of good practice around HIV and AIDS and employment, people with disabilities, we've seen this, providers of lifting machine operators, how about pregnancy, these are the codes of good practice. Now, these will not give you the competitive advantage in an industry, but it's just good practice. Everyone is expected to, toe such lines for good practice sake, as it were. All right, and so please take note of this. And again, you as managers, apart from looking for that gap for competitive advantage, you also look to benchmark yourselves against these codes of good practice, and you need to know them. Remember, like we always say, ignorance is no defense. You can't say we didn't know. You have to know what does the minister say in terms of this area. Otherwise, if you then don't comply, obviously, there are such things as fines that might actually come with it. Areas of application, all right. Best practices that are relevant to a unit. Where do you apply it? And like we're saying, aspects of your business where best practice in staff development, maybe recruitment, maybe retention. Apply would include such things as how staff are recruited, adding innovations into your businesses, training staff, reducing overheads, increasing productivity, decreasing staff turnover. These are some of the areas that you might think of for application's sake. Right. Yeah. Now, these best practices now, that's what we're talking about, that are relevant to a unit. And normally we're saying you need to identify these. And the essence of identifying and sharing best practices is essentially to learn from others and also to reuse knowledge. And effective sharing of best practices can also help organization in so many ways. And these are the ways you would see on my slides, where you can actually get help to, improve, like identify and replace poor practices, maybe in terms of raising performance of poor performers closer to that of the best, avoiding reinventing the wheel. It's not always that you have to reinvent the wheel, but see best practices from others, adopt those. Typical innovation, minimizing rework caused by maybe poor methods, saving of costs, all of that also applies. And so at the end of the day, we do have some guideline. You're going to see this in your study guides, best practices guidelines, right? You start off with the understanding best practice guidelines, with knowledge there, assessment, compare your own practices, and then you improve. Again, in between there, I suppose that's where you would also find the gap. All right. Now, there are a couple of approaches that you can also use to identify best practices. And it's important, again, it's incumbent upon you as managers to identify these best practices. And what sort of methods can you use? Now, this area leans to knowledge management. Normally, how do you manage knowledge in an organization? And obviously, can be applied to best practices as well. So we got a range of alternative approaches that you can use to identify best practices. And like I'm saying, it's in the realms of knowledge management tools. So take, for instance, we have what we call after action reviews. So you let an action run through and then you review it. How did we do this? Do we learn from it? Do we see some best practices we undertook in here, which we can repeat? Or are there some bad things we also did, which we might want to drop off? And all of this coming through the after action reviews. It's more like you run, you stand, you look back. That's your after action reviews. And then there's also what we call knowledge harvesting. So for all the knowledge that you have, you would have to really harvest it and keep it and make sure it's documented and all of that. You've seen in your companies, maybe you do have what we call the exit interviews. Exit interviews are essentially meant to identify best practices or the bad ones for that matter. So you've got an employee who has resigned and you talk about a number of things. And obviously when someone is leaving, they don't have any restrictions. They can talk about anything. They're not afraid of anyone anymore. So you'd find these exit interviews could also provide a lot whole lot of information. And then we also talk about communities of practice. Communities of practice. And this can be captured in so many ways. And so you might have different departments that act as a community of practice. And so from that perspective, again, you identify best practices as you're going through that. And some of the areas that may require improvements in your companies now, and this you can actually bring it closer to home, all right? So for you guys as TCM, you might want to apply or at least analyze current operating practices. And these are some of the areas you might want to look at. So quality management, how is it done at TCM? Information management, that's closer to home, that's closer to where you are. Customer service also, you might also apply it there. Human resources and human resource management, you can also apply it there, whether it's marketing, whether it's part of administration, and then also staff training. So all of these are areas really you might want to look at and apply some of your operating practices. All right, I think let me stop here. I see we almost getting to the end of it. Let me stop here. And this is the concept of benchmarking. Any questions, comments? Of course, I take note, Mahlala had something to do with administration that would require Aftalin. That's what I want to also accommodate here.
Yes.
All right,
Vitaly,
no question.
sorry, Mister, you can
Go
continue.
for it.
You ask us. Oh, okay. Vitaly, yeah, this is more for you. And morning.
Sally, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Dr. Sanford.
All right, thank you,
Okay.
mate. With regards to the submissions,
Yes.
I received, I don't know if all the other colleagues, received their emails with login credentials and confirmations that they've been created on the portal.
Yes, yes.
So how do we manage, the submissions, going forward? Because I've been sending you my submissions, so I've emailed you my, like both of them, and you have confirmed, as received them.
Yes, we can submit through the student portal at this point, or even on email. That way, still fine. So, but if you submit on the student portal, just open it up, submit my.
You're breaking up. I'm struggling to hear.
Can you hear me now?
Just continue, then I'll tell if you sounding better.
Yes, I was saying, so now you have two
Yeah.
options. It's either you can drop your POE on the student portal, and then after submitting on the student portal, just let me know to say I've uploaded my POE so that I can go and download it and submit it for assessment. Or
So-
either you can also submit on my email, it's still fine.
Okay, can I personally continue with sending you my
Yes.
POEs? Okay.
Yes, that's not a problem.
And then feedback, remediation,
Yeah,
like
so-
everything that has to do, with the feedback. How do we receive that?
Yes, I'll send feedback via email, because the thing is with this program, it's not mapped out in a way where we can upload your results on the student portal. So they are working on it. So at the
Oh.
moment, I'll be sending emails direct to you guys with regard to your results.
Okay, so and they haven't finalized our first module submissions yet.
Yes, so the thing is, the assessor said it's done to marking. So now I need to find transport and go and collect, because the assessor is in Pretoria, so they need to be collected. But he said it's done. So I'm
Okay.
hoping, yeah, I'll by Friday, I'm hoping we'll receive our result.
Okay.
All right.
All right, cool. Thank you.
All right.
All right. I also see a hand, Avishka, please come in.
Hi, thank you. Vitaly, I
Yes.
would also like to personally submit my stuff to you on email because if I'm hearing it either way, you have to download it and send it to the
Mm.
assessor.
Yes,
So
yes.
I am content with sending you an email notification of my POE submissions.
Yes, I'm still fine with it. I feel like that's the best way if you send it via my email so that I can have it direct and then I should just download it and send it for assessment. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, so I will do it as well via email and not the portal. That will be sent directly to you. Just to confirm, I'm a bit delayed on this PAE as this is my first class. As you've known, Vitaly, I've been emailing you on my workload,
Yes,
which has caused me to travel extensively during the end of October and November or beginning of November.
Mhm.
So I'd like to find out if personally I could get an extension. I don't know about the rest of the team, but next week Friday, I'm not going to be able to submit my stuff by the 25th of November.
yes. I've looked into that because now this is the last module for the year. So at least we'll have the privilege to do our POE without attending any other classes. So I will grant everyone an extension. So by tomorrow, next week is our last class. So by next week, I'll be able to tell you when can we submit our POEs.
Thank you so much.
All right.
All right, thanks, Vitaly, and also thanks, Fishka, and the comments. So in that case, I suppose we can then call it a day. I see our time is up now. And thanks very much for attending. And remember, next week is our final week. And after that, we're done. And so enjoy what's left of your day and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, same to you.
Hi, sorry, Stanford, just to before you drop off, is it possible to tell me on the previous two classes which activities the team needs to be up until so I can obviously catch up?
All right. So what we did for the past 2 weeks, we're looking at innovation because your module is made up of 3 sections. Really, that's what you're going to find in all of those activities. Something to do with innovation, and then there's benchmarking, and then there's also the teamwork, which is what we're going to look at next week. And at this stage, I think you should be done with all activities that have to do with innovation. Right now, we've looked at benchmarking, and so if you can also go and complete those and finish off. And then by next week, when we look at teamwork, you only have those sections that have to do with teamwork, and then you can finalize.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.